There's a story people love to tell about success, that it's all timing, talent, and luck. That the right people were born into the right circumstances, caught the right break, and everything just fell into place. It's a comfortable story. It also happens to be almost completely wrong. The 10 people you're about to hear about didn't come from money. Most of them came from nothing. Some of them came from worse than nothing. They were told no so many times that most people in their shoes would have packed it in years earlier. They slept in vans, scraped together change for food, got fired from the very jobs they were chasing, and watched their dreams fall apart in front of them more than once. But here's what sets them apart. They kept going. Not because it was glamorous. Not because someone handed them a roadmap. They kept going because stopping wasn't something they were willing to do. And what came next changed their lives, the entertainment industry, and in some cases, world. These are 10 celebrities who didn't just talk about hard work. They lived it, bled for it, and ultimately proved that it pays off in ways most people can't even imagine. Number 1, Dwayne Johnson. From $7 to the top of Hollywood in 1995, Dwayne Johnson was sitting in his apartment with exactly $7 in his pocket. No more, no less. He'd just been cut from the Canadian Football League after a brief failed attempt to make it as a professional player. His NFL dream had already burned out. Before that, he had nothing to show for years of grinding, no career, no money, no clear path forward. What most people don't know is that before the muscles, before the catchphrases, before he became one of the highest paid actors on the planet, Dwayne Johnson was living in a tiny apartment with his parents after getting evicted. His father, Rocky Johnson, was a professional wrestler, and as a last resort, Dwayne decided to follow in those footsteps. Not because he was passionate about it, because he had nothing else. The early years in WWE were brutal in a way that the polished highlights never show. He wasn't an overnight success. His debut under his given name was a disaster. The crowd turned on him almost immediately. WWE had been pushing him as a clean-cut babyface, and the audience rejected it hard. He was booed out of arenas. Other performers with more momentum might have crumbled. Johnson adapted. He rebranded. He leaned into the character the fans were already writing. For him, and The Rock was born not from a corporate boardroom decision, but from a performer who paid close enough attention to failure to figure out what success actually looked like. By the late 1990s, The Rock was one of WWE's biggest draws. But even that wasn't enough. He had his eye on Hollywood, and Hollywood wasn't particularly interested. His early film roles were modest at best. The Scorpion King in 2002 gave him traction, but it took years of choosing the right projects, building relationships, and outworking everyone else in the room before he became the franchise-carrying force he is today. Today, he consistently ranks as one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world. He's produced films, launched tequila brands, built clothing lines, and expanded into virtually every corner of the entertainment business. All of it traces back to one apartment, one eviction notice, and $7 sitting on a counter. But Dwayne Johnson's story is almost calm compared to what some of the others on this list had to survive just to get started. Number 2, Oprah Winfrey. The most unlikely media empire in history, Oprah Winfrey was born in rural Mississippi in 1954 to a single teenage mother in a situation that, statistically, had almost no good outcomes. She grew up in deep poverty, shuffled between family members, and experienced abuse that she would only speak about publicly decades later. There were stretches of her childhood where she had nothing, no stability, no safety, and no reason to believe things would change. By the time she was a teenager, Oprah had fought her way to a partial scholarship and was attending college in Nashville. She landed a job in local radio while still in high school, then transitioned into television news as a co-anchor at a Baltimore station. That's where the first real failure hit. She was fired. Not quietly moved around, fired, and reportedly told by executives that she was unfit for TV news and too emotionally invested in the stories she was covering. That criticism, which was meant to end her career, turned out to be a perfect description of exactly what made her extraordinary. The quality they fired her for, the emotional depth, the genuine connection to her subjects, was the same quality that made her the most watched daytime talk show host in television history when she finally got the right platform for it. Her show launched in Chicago in 1986 and within a year had gone national. By the early 1990s, the Oprah Winfrey Show was a cultural institution. She built a production company, launched a magazine, created a book club that could turn an unknown author into a bestseller overnight, and eventually formed OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network. Her net worth crossed $1 billion. She became the first black female billionaire in history. None of that was supposed to happen to the girl from Kosciuszko, Mississippi, who was living in poverty and being told she wasn't cut out for television. But Oprah had something that couldn't be fired or edited out, an absolute refusal to stop moving forward. She once said that she doesn't believe in failure. That what others call failure, she calls data. It's a useful philosophy for someone who had every reason to give up before she started. And then there's the man who took refusing to give up to a level that almost broke him before it made him famous. Number 3, Eminem, Detroit, defeat, and a legacy that outlasted them all if you grow up in certain parts of Detroit in the 1980s. The expected outcome isn't celebrity, it's survival. Marshall Mathers, the kid who would eventually become Eminem, grew up moving constantly, living with a mother who struggled in ways her son would later describe in painful detail, bouncing between Michigan and Missouri, attending multiple schools, failing ninth grade twice, and eventually dropping out entirely. He was a white kid obsessed with hip-hop in a genre and city that weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. He got into battle rapping as a teenager, performing in local underground events where he was regularly the only white face in the room. The hostility was real. He pushed through it. He got better. He got sharper. But getting better still wasn't enough for a long time. Eminem spent years submitting demo tapes to labels that came back with rejections or, worse, silence. He worked at a restaurant to survive, sometimes barely making that work. There were periods where feeding himself and his young daughter Haley was a genuine daily concern, not a dramatic metaphor. The turning point came when a tape of his reached Dr. Dre, arguably the most important connection in hip-hop. Dre was blown away, signed him immediately, and helped produce the Slim Shady LP, which dropped in 1999. The album moved 6 million copies in the US alone. The Marshall Mathers LP the following year set records that still stand. He became, at one point, the best-selling musical artist of the entire decade. The success brought its own complications, legal battles, personal struggles, substance issues he would later confront publicly, but through all of it, the output never stopped. His technical skill as an MC only grew more refined with time. He's now considered one of the greatest rappers who ever lived by critics and peers alike. A title made more remarkable by how close to the ground level he started. The kid who failed ninth grade twice now sells out stadiums on multiple continents. And even, after everything, he's still releasing music that holds its own against artists half his age. But if Eminem's story is about persistence in the face of structural rejection, the next person on this list had to fight a different battle, one against an industry that didn't know what to do with her. Number 4, Lady Gaga, dropped, dismissed, and ultimately unstoppable Stefani Joanne Angelina Germanotta had been playing piano since she was 4 years old. She was classically trained, enrolled at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, at 17, one of the youngest students to gain admission to that program, and dropped out at 19 to pursue music full-time. She told her father she'd give herself a year. If it didn't work, she'd go back to school. The year was rough. She was signed to Def Jam Recordings when she was 19, but the label dropped her after only 3 months. The reason, reportedly, was that they didn't know how to market her. She was too theatrical, too weird, too hard to box into. An existing category. The industry, in short, told her she was too much. Gaga went back to performing in small venues, writing songs and shopping them to anyone who would listen. She started attracting attention through a grueling schedule of small club performances and collaborations with music producers in the underground scene. Her demos eventually landed in the hands of Akon, who was impressed enough to bring her to Interscope. She was signed, this time staying signed. Just Born This Way. Alone, her second album sold 6 million copies in its first week and broke multiple Billboard chart records. She became the first artist to have 5 number 1 singles from a single album on the Hot Dance/Electronic Songs chart. She then made a left turn into acting, earning a Golden Globe for her performance in American Horror Story, and later, an Academy Award nomination for A Star Is Born, where she also performed and wrote the original songs. Her song Shallow from that film won the Oscar for Best Original Song. None of this surprised people who had actually watched her work. It surprised the industry that dropped her because it couldn't classify her. There's something worth pausing on here. The very qualities that got Lady Gaga rejected, the eccentricity, the theatrical ambition, the refusal to sound or look like anyone else, are exactly what built one of the most durable careers in modern pop music. Being Told You're Too Much turned out to be the most accidentally accurate prediction of her career anyone could have made. Gaga had to fight an industry. The next person on this list had to fight something more fundamental: basic survival. Number 5, Jim Carrey. Homeless at 15, headlining Hollywood at 32, Jim Carrey's childhood looks, in retrospect, like a dark comedy written by someone who was either very cruel or very optimistic about outcomes. He was born in Newmarket, Ontario, to a family that was fighting financial instability his entire childhood. His father, Percy, lost his job as an accountant when Jim was a teenager, and the family's situation deteriorated rapidly. They moved into a van. They eventually were living on the grounds of a factory in Scarborough, where the whole family worked shifts to survive. Jim dropped out of school at 15 to help support his parents. He was already doing stand-up comedy, partly for escape, partly because it was the one thing he seemed to be built for, but the early shows weren't gentle with him. His first significant performance at Yuck Yuck's Comedy Club in Toronto ended with the audience booing him off stage. He walked out into the parking lot and made a decision: he was going to keep going. He moved to Los Angeles in his late teens with almost nothing. He used to drive to Mulholland Drive at night and sit looking over the city, and at some point, he's told this story himself, he wrote himself a check for $10 million for acting services rendered and dated it 10 years in the future. He kept it in his wallet. It was insane, and it was motivational, and it turned out to be roughly accurate. Carrey spent years building his stand-up reputation, eventually landing a spot on In Living Color in the early 1990s. Then came 1994, one of the most remarkable single-year runs in Hollywood history. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber all released that year. All three were massive hits. He went from a working comic to a bankable movie star in 12 months. The $10 million check moment has become one of those stories that gets repeated in every motivational speech ever given, and it's worth noting that the check he eventually received for Dumb and Dumber was exactly $10 million. He found out his father had passed away while he was filming the movie and placed the check in his father's jacket pocket before the burial. Jim Carrey took a childhood of poverty and instability and turned it into fuel. And then he out-hustled an industry that had given him every reason not to be there. But even Carrey's story doesn't quite match the raw determination of the next person. On this list, a man who refused to sell his script unless they let him star in it. Number 6, Sylvester Stallone. The script, the dog, and the comeback nobody saw coming in the winter of 1975. Sylvester Stallone was broke enough to sell his dog. Not as an expression literally. He stood outside a liquor store and sold his beloved bull mastiff, Butkus, to a stranger for $25 because he couldn't afford to feed the animal. Days later, he wrote the entire first draft of Rocky in 3.5 days. The script was good enough that producers wanted to buy it. They offered him $125,000 for it, which in 1975, for a broke, struggling actor, was life-changing money. There was one condition: Stallone couldn't star in the film. The studio wanted an established name, Ryan O'Neal, and Burt Reynolds were reportedly discussed. Stallone said no. He walked away from $125,000. Because he believed the only way the story worked was if he was the one telling it. The offers kept coming and kept getting bigger. At one point, the studio reportedly offered $360,000 for the script without Stallone attached. He kept saying no. By the time a deal was finally struck, the budget had been severely cut to allow Stallone to star, and his payment for the script was dramatically lower than what he'd been offered without himself attached. He didn't care. He went back to the stranger who had bought his dog, explained the situation, begged to buy Butkus back. and eventually paid $15,000, far more than the $25 he'd sold him for, to get the dog back. Rocky was released in November 1976. It won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It grossed $225 million on a $1 million budget. Sylvester Stallone received Oscar nominations for both acting and writing, becoming only the 3rd person in history to receive both nominations for the same film. What makes this story resonate isn't just the success, it's the clarity Stallone had about what he was willing to accept. He knew what the story meant. He knew what his role in it needed to be. And he refused to compromise that vision even when the financial pressure was at its most extreme. That kind of certainty about your own worth is rare. The woman who comes next on this list had to rebuild that certainty from rubble. Number 7, J.K. Rowling. Welfare, Rejection, and the biggest book series in history. In 1994, Joanne Rowling was living in Edinburgh with her infant daughter, recently divorced, clinically depressed, on welfare, and writing a novel about a boy wizard in longhand at a cafe because she couldn't afford to heat her apartment. She had the idea for Harry Potter on a train in 1990 and spent the next several years developing it while her personal life fell apart around her. Her marriage had ended, she'd lost her mother to multiple sclerosis, and she later described this period of her life as her rock-bottom time, where she felt herself to be a complete failure by every conventional measure. She was a single mother with no job and no money, sitting in cafes to stay warm. The manuscript she eventually produced was rejected by 12 publishing houses. 12. Each one looked at the same 500 pages that would eventually become one of the most successful literary properties in human history and said no. Some reportedly rejected it quickly. Others held it for months before passing. Bloomsbury finally said, yes, reportedly, because the 8-year-old daughter of one editor read the first chapter and immediately asked for more. The advance was modest. Rowling was advised to get a day job because children's fiction didn't pay enough to live on. She had no idea what was coming. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone launched in 1997. The rest is cultural history that's almost too large to summarize. The 7-book series sold over 500 million copies worldwide. The film franchise grossed more than $7 billion. The theme parks, merchandise, and spin-off properties generate billions more every year. J.K. Rowling became the first person to become a billionaire through book writing, though she has since donated enough to charities that she's technically dropped below that threshold again, a fact that is, in its own way, extraordinary. The woman who was on welfare and couldn't heat her apartment in 1994 was a decade later richer than the Queen of England, and she got there by refusing to let 12 consecutive rejections be the final word. But if Rowling's story is about surviving rejection, the next person's story is about building an empire out of sheer physical will. Number 8, Arnold Schwarzenegger. From a tiny Austrian town to 2 different empires, Arnold Schwarzenegger was born in Thau, Austria, a village of fewer than 3,000 people in 1947. His family had essentially nothing. His father was a local police chief who was reportedly demanding and difficult, and the house Arnold grew up in didn't have a flushing toilet or a refrigerator until he was well into childhood. There was no obvious pathway from that starting point to anywhere particularly remarkable. Arnold decided, as a teenager, that he was going to become a bodybuilding champion. Not because it seemed realistic, it very much didn't, but because he had decided. The commitment he brought to the gym was borderline obsessive. He was training twice a day as a teenager, sometimes breaking into the local gym on weekends when it was locked so he wouldn't miss a session. He moved to Munich at 18 and won his first Mr. Universe title at 20, becoming the youngest person ever to hold that title at the time. He went on to win Mr. Olympia 7 times, retiring as arguably the greatest competitive bodybuilder in history. Then he moved to Hollywood. His English was heavily accented, his name was difficult to pronounce, and industry insiders told him both of those things would prevent him from ever becoming a major movie star. He was advised to change his name. He didn't. He was told to consider character parts rather than leading roles. He disagreed. He kept networking, kept training, kept pushing, and landed the role of Conan the Barbarian in 1982. Then The Terminator in 1984, a performance so iconic that the line "I'll be back" became one of the most quoted phrases in cinema history. His film career generated billions in box office revenue. Then he pivoted again, entering California politics with the same aggressive energy he'd applied to every previous field. He was elected governor of California in 2003 in a recall election, serving 2 terms and becoming one of the most recognizable political figures in the state's history. 3 entirely separate careers: bodybuilding champion, Hollywood A-lister, state governor, all built from the same starting point. A boy in rural Austria with no money, no connections, and an impossible amount of self-belief. The person who comes next on this list built something arguably even larger from a starting point that had just as many reasons to lead nowhere. Number 9. Jay-Z. From the Marcy Projects to a billion-dollar empire, Sean Carter grew up in the Marcy Houses, a housing project in Brooklyn that produced more than its share of trauma. His father left when he was 11 years old, a wound that Jay-Z has returned to in his music repeatedly over the decades. He witnessed violence as a routine part of daily life. He got into the drug trade as a teenager, selling in ways he has since spoken about openly, not to glamorize it, but to contextualize just how limited the options seemed from where he was standing. Music was a parallel obsession. He'd been rapping since he was a kid, freestyling in the stairwells of the projects, eventually developing a style that was sharper and more technically sophisticated than most of what was being released commercially. He started shopping his music to labels in the early 1990s. The labels weren't interested. This is where most people stop. Jay-Z didn't. He, along with 2 partners, founded Rockefeller Records with money they'd scraped together themselves, pressed their own CDs, and sold them out of the trunk of a car. He then leveraged a regional distribution deal to get his debut album, Reasonable Doubt, released in 1996. It moved modestly at first. It's now considered one of the greatest debut albums in hip-hop history. The commercial breakthrough came with his 3rd album, Volume 2, Hard Knock Life, in 1998, which opened at number 1 and sold over 5 million copies in the United States. From that point, the momentum never stopped. He's released 14 number 1 albums. He married Beyoncé. He founded or co-founded Rockaware, Armand de Brignac Champagne, D'Essai Cognac, Tidal, and multiple other ventures. He became the first hip-hop billionaire. He also eventually reconciled with his father, a story documented in the deeply personal album 444, which suggests that the internal work was as significant as the professional climb. Jay-Z built something that genuinely had no blueprint. He came from a place where the expected outcome was incarceration or worse, and instead he built a billion-dollar empire by refusing to wait for permission from an industry that told him it wasn't interested. The final person on this list didn't come from the projects. He came from a van in Hawaii, which turned out to be its own kind of starting point. Number 10. Chris Pratt, from Living. In a van to the Marvel Universe, Chris Pratt was 19 years old and homeless in Maui, Hawaii. He was living in a van and a tent on the beach, working as a daytime waiter and spending his evenings going to parties and not thinking particularly hard about his future. This is not an exaggeration. He was, by his own repeated description, not applying himself in any meaningful direction, scraping by on tips and largely drifting. Then Rae Dawn Chong, an actress who was visiting the island, walked into the restaurant where he was working. They got to talking. She saw something in him, cast him in her short film, and he followed that thread to Los Angeles. He didn't have a career plan. He had a thread. The early years in Hollywood were more grinding than the origin story suggests. He landed small parts here and there, a recurring role on Everwood, a brief appearance on the OC, but nothing that suggested he was on a trajectory towards stardom. He put on significant weight for a role, and found himself getting offered the kind of parts that come with the assumption that you've given up on leading man status. He played Andy Dwyer on Parks and Recreation, which became beloved, but Andy was a lovable idiot, not exactly a launching pad for action franchises. Then Marvel called, or rather, he fought hard to be considered. He auditioned for Peter Quill's Star-Lord in Guardians of the Galaxy and wasn't the obvious choice. He was a comedic character actor with an extra 40 pounds on him. but he committed completely. He trained relentlessly, dropped the weight, and walked into that role with a physical transformation and a performance that became the backbone of one of Marvel's most unexpected hits. Guardians of the Galaxy opened to over $94 million domestically in its first weekend. Chris Pratt became a genuine box office draw overnight, seemingly out of nowhere, except that nowhere had actually been a decade and a half of relentless small steps, each one taken by someone who refused to believe the part they were currently playing was the last one they'd ever get. He went on to reprise the role in the Avengers franchise, became the lead of the Jurassic World series, and is now one of the most consistently bankable stars in Hollywood. He still talks about the van in Hawaii like it happened to someone he used to know, because in a real sense, it did. Here's what's interesting about these 10 stories when you look at them side by side: none of them follow the same arc. Some of these people had natural talent that was never in question, the only obstacle was getting a chance to use it. Others were told directly and repeatedly that they didn't have what it takes. Some were fighting poverty. Some were fighting an industry. Some were fighting their own personal circumstances. Some were doing all three at once. But there's one thing that links every single name on this list: not talent, not luck, not timing, though timing played its part in some of them. The thing they all share is that they refused to let a single failure, or a string of failures, or a decade of failures become their final answer. Dwayne Johnson had $7. Oprah was told she was unfit for television. Eminem failed 9th grade twice. Lady Gaga was dropped at 19. Jim Carrey was homeless at 15. Sylvester Stallone sold his dog. J.K. Rowling was on welfare and got rejected by 12 publishers. Arnold Schwarzenegger was told his name and his accent were disqualifying. Jay-Z sold CDs from the trunk of a car after every label passed. Chris Pratt was living in a van on a beach in Hawaii. Every single one of them had a perfectly reasonable moment to stop. A moment where quitting would have made complete sense to any rational observer, and none of them took it. The question worth sitting with after you watch a video like this isn't which of them is the most inspiring. The real question is what you do with your own reasonable moment to stop, if you had one. Or if you've already had one. Or if you're in the middle of one right now. Because the distance between where these people started and where they ended up wasn't closed by talent alone. It was closed by one more day, one more attempt, one more refusal to let the current circumstances be the permanent ones. Hard work paying off isn't a guarantee. But every person on this list proves it's a very real possibility, and for some of them, it turned out to be something far bigger than they ever thought to ask for.